The air over the German coast was 60 degrees below zero. Yet Oberleutnant Dieter von Reuter was sweating profusely beneath his leather flight helmet. Approaching at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour, his Messerschmitt Bf 109 was locked onto an American bomber that had drifted from its protective flock. It was the standard, lethal Luftwaffe tactic: hit the flying fortress head-on, exactly where its defenses were blind. But as Dieter squeezed his firing trigger, the impossible happened. The massive bomber bristled like a mechanized porcupine. Muzzle flashes erupted simultaneously from the nose, the cheeks, the radio hatch, and the waist. 16 heavy machine guns vomiting an unbroken sheet of fire. The hunters had just plunged blindly into a flying slaughterhouse. The 8th Air Force, in the spring of 1943, was a meat grinder. The strategic doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces relied on unescorted, high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. The theory argued that heavily armed bombers, flying in tight combat box formations, could defend themselves against enemy fighters without the need for fighter escorts. The reality, playing out over the frozen skies of occupied Europe, was a bloodbath. American bomber crews were suffering catastrophic losses, and morale was bleeding out into the damp English soil. At RAF Alconbury, the mood in the 92nd Bombardment Group was grim. Empty bunks were a daily, haunting sight. Into this atmosphere of mounting desperation, a radical experiment was born. If standard B-17 flying fortresses couldn't protect themselves, the top brass reasoned, then they needed a heavily armored chaperone, a gunship that looked like a bomber but fought like a dreadnought. Captain Arthur Hughes stood on the tarmac, the bitter wind whipping the collar of his sheepskin jacket, staring up at the monstrosity his crew had been assigned. Ground crews swarmed over the aircraft like anxious surgeons. Officially, it was designated a YB-40 flying cruiser. To Hughes and his men, she was christened the Chicago Typewriter. "She looks heavy, Artie," muttered First Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Gallagher, the ship's co-pilot, handing Hughes a steaming mug of terrible chicory coffee. "Heavy isn't the word, Tommy," Hughes replied, his eyes tracing the aggressive new lines of the aircraft. "She's practically a flying tank." Standard B-17’s were armed with around 10 to 12 .50 caliber Browning machine guns, many of them single mounts, and possessed a fatal blind spot directly in the nose. The Germans had quickly figured this out, pioneering the terrifying 12 o'clock high head-on attack. The Chicago Typewriter was built specifically to counter this. Master Sergeant William Smitty Henderson, the lead mechanic, wiped grease from his forehead and walked over to the officers. "We're done, Captain." She's topped off. 11,000 rounds of ammunition loaded. Hughes whistled softly. Standard bombers carried perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 rounds. "Walk me through the hardware again, Smitty." "It's a firing squad with wings, sir," Smitty said with a mix of pride and apprehension. "We installed the new Bendix chin turret right under the bombardier's nose, packing twin 50s. The cheek stations on both sides of the nose? Upgraded to twin mounts? We swapped the single-waist guns for staggered twin mounts, so the gunners won't bump asses while tracking targets. The radio compartment has a powered twin-gun turret instead of the old single pop-up. Top turret, ball turret, and tail stinger remain the same, but the tail's been beefed up with extra armor. Count 'em up. 16 heavy barrels. And the weight?" Gallagher asked, looking at the ballooning tires supporting the colossal mass. "She's carrying nearly 4,000 pounds of extra armor plating to protect the crew stations and the ammunition feeds," Smitty admitted, his tone dropping. "Without a bomb load, she still weighs substantially more than a fully loaded standard fort. The engines are tuned as high as they'll go, but she's going to handle like a pregnant whale in molasses." Inside the fuselage, the atmosphere was claustrophobic. The bomb bay, completely devoid of explosives, had been retrofitted into a massive ammunition magazine. Elaborate, motorized feed tracks ran along the interior ribs of the aircraft, channeling continuous belts of .50 caliber shells to the waist and tail gunners. Staff Sergeant James O'Reilly, a kid from Brooklyn who manned the top turret, patted the cold steel of his twin Brownings. "Let the Krauts come," he muttered to the navigator, Lieutenant Richard Vance. "They think they're jumping a stray sheep. They're going to catch a mouthful of wolf." On the other side of the English Channel, the men who would soon test the Chicago typewriter were completely unaware of her existence. Oberleutnant Dieter von Reuter, boss a rising star in Jagdgeschwader 1, JG 1, stationed at the Jever airfield near the German coast. At 24, he was already a seasoned veteran, with 20 confirmed victories. Operating under the legendary commander Heinz Baer, Dieter and his fellow pilots viewed the American daylight raids as a deadly but predictable game of mathematics. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G. 6 fighters they flew were nimble and deadly, but the sheer size of the American combat boxes was intimidating. Flying into the interlocking fire of 30 B-17’s was suicide. Therefore, the Luftwaffe tactic was ruthlessly analytical. Wait for the bombers to be damaged by flak or engine trouble, watch them fall out of the protective formation, and then slaughter the stragglers. Better yet, attack the leading elements from the front, slashing through the formation at blinding speed before the American gunners could traverse their heavy weapons. Sitting in the officers' mess, Dieter watched his wingman, Feldwebel Karl Weber, nervously rolling a silver coin across his knuckles. "The radar stations are active," Karl said quietly, the tension evident in his young, pale face. "A massive buildup over East Anglia. They are coming again." Dieter placed a steady hand on Karl's shoulder. "Let them come, Karl. Remember the training. We climb into the sun, we attack from the nose, 3 seconds of fire, then dive away. Do not linger. Do not tail chase. We hit them where they are blind." Dieter had no way of knowing that the Americans had just given their blind spot teeth. The 13th of June, 1943. The target was the heavily fortified U-boat pens at Kiel, a deep penetration raid into the heart of the German naval war machine. At Alconbury, green flares arced into the pre-dawn sky, signaling engine start. The roar of hundreds of Wright Cyclone radial engines shattered the morning quiet, shaking the ground with a rhythmic, thunderous vibration. In the cockpit of the Chicago typewriter, Captain Hughes fought with the controls just to taxi. The extreme weight of the armor and ammunition made the bomber horribly nose-heavy and sluggish. "Brakes are mushy," Hughes yelled over the deafening roar, his forearms already straining. "Manifold pressure looks good, but she's dragging." "We're going to need every inch of runway, Artie," Gallagher shouted back, his hand hovering near the throttles. When their turn came, Hughes pushed the throttles to the firewall. The 4 massive engines howled in protest. The Chicago typewriter lumbered down the tarmac, gathering speed with agonizing slowness. At the point where a standard, fully bomb-laden B-17 would have lifted its tail, the gunship remained stubbornly glued to the earth. "Come on, you heavy bitch, fly!" Hughes roared, pulling back on the yoke with both hands. The end of the runway was approaching terrifyingly fast, a line of dark trees looming in the mist. At the very last second, with the airspeed indicator barely crossing the red line, the heavy tires left the concrete. The aircraft shuddered, fighting gravity, clearing the tree line by less than 50 feet as they began the agonizingly slow climb to 25,000 feet. The reality of their experimental aircraft became apparent. To stay with the formation, Hughes had to run the engines hotter and at higher RPMs than the standard bombers. "Cylinder head temperatures are creeping into the yellow, Captain," Gallagher warned, tapping the glass of the gauges. "Keep the cowl flaps open," Hughes ordered. "We just need to get to altitude and tuck into the lead element." Their assignment was highly specific. They were placed on the outside edge of the lead squadron, deliberately positioned as bait. They were supposed to look like a vulnerable flank, inviting the Luftwaffe to attack the front of the formation. 2 hours later, over the frigid expanse of the North Sea, The temperature inside the unpressurized cabin plummeted to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost coated the inside of the plexiglass windows. The crew breathed through oxygen masks, the rubber cold against their faces, their bodies wrapped in thick, electrically heated suits that frequently shorted out, leaving them shivering violently. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant Martin "Marty" Lewis sat behind the newly installed Bendix chin turret controls. He wasn't dropping bombs today. His sole job was to operate the twin 50S via a remote site. Above him, the navigator had his own pair of cheek guns. "Test fire your stations, boys," Hugh's voice crackled over the intercom. Short bursts of machine gun fire echoed through the fuselage, vibrating the floorboards. The sheer concussive force of 16 guns, firing briefly in unison, was staggering, the air filled with the acrid stench of cordite. Far below, on the German coast, the warning sirens wailed across the Jever airfield. Oberleutnant Dieter von Reuter sprinted toward his Bf 109, the ground crew already cranking the inertia starter. The Daimler-Benz engine coughed, spat black smoke, and roared to life. Dieter strapped into the cramped cockpit, checking his oxygen supply and his Revi gun sight. "Schwarm 1, take off." The flight leader's voice crackled in Dieter's headset. Dieter pushed the throttle forward, feeling the massive torque of the engine press him back into his seat. Within minutes, his squadron of 12 fighters was slicing upward through the cloud layers, ascending into the brilliant, blinding blue of the high-altitude arena. Ground control radar vectored them toward the incoming threat. Dicke Auto's fat cars, the German slang for the heavy bombers. "Bandits grid sector, Dora Heinrich, altitude 7,000 meters, the controller announced mechanically. A massive stream, proceed to intercept. At 24,000 feet, Dieter leveled off. The cold up here was absolute, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins made him oblivious to it. He adjusted his tinted goggles and scanned the horizon. Then, he saw them. It was a sight that never failed to inspire a mixture of awe and dread. Against the deep blue of the stratosphere, hundreds of contrails scratched the sky. Beneath the vapor trails flew the American Armada, vast, staggered boxes of silver and olive-drab bombers, moving with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a thunderstorm. "There they are," Dieter whispered into his mask. "I see them, Oberleutnant," came the nervous voice of Karl, flying tightly off Dieter's right wing. Dieter analyzed the formation. The escorting P-47 Thunderbolts were struggling at the edge of their fuel range. Soon, they would have to turn back, leaving the bombers entirely unprotected. "Wait for the little friends to leave," the flight leader ordered. For 10 agonizing minutes, the German fighters shadowed the bomber stream, flying parallel, but out of range. Finally, the American P-47's wagged their wings and banked away in a wide turn back toward England. The bombers were naked. "All right, Schwarm 1, we execute frontal assault on the lead box," Dieter commanded. "Target the aircraft on the outer edges. Form line astern. Follow me in." Dieter threw his fighter into a steep banking turn, advancing the throttle to maximum power. He swung out wide, racing ahead of the bomber formation so he could turn back and face them head-on. The closing speed would be astronomical. The bombers flying at 200 miles per hour, the fighters diving in at nearly 400 miles per hour. They would have mere seconds to aim, fire, and violently dive away before colliding in midair. Dieter selected his target, a B-17, on the left flank of the lead element. It looked perfectly standard. No fighter escort. A sitting duck. He flipped the safety off the firing button on his control stick. "Steady, Karl," he transmitted. "Stay right on my tail. Let's show these Americans the fatal flaw in their design. Fighters, 12 o'clock high, coming in fast." The frantic scream from the top turret gunner, James O'Reilly, blasted through the intercom of the Chicago typewriter. Captain Hughes gripped the yoke, his knuckles white. Through the armored windshield, he saw the incoming threat tiny, rapidly expanding dots diving out of the sun like angry wasps. "Hold your fire until they are within 1,000 yards, Hughes ordered, his voice remarkably calm, despite the thundering of his own heart. "Marty, you take the leader. Let them commit to the pass." In the cramped nose compartment, Marty Lewis hunched over the chin turret sight, his hands sweating inside his heavy leather gloves. He tracked the leading Messerschmitt, framing the yellow-nosed fighter in his crosshairs. Beside him, the navigator braced himself against the twin-cheek guns, ready to catch any fighter that broke left or right. Dieter von Reuter narrowed his eyes, fighting the glare of the sun. The targeted B-17 was growing exponentially in his Revi sight. At 1,500 yards, he could see the spinning propellers. At 1,200 yards, he could make out the cockpit windows. It was time. He braced himself for the usual meager return fire from the top turret and the single, inaccurate nose gun. "Now," Dieter whispered, his thumb pressing down on the firing button. The 20mm cannon, firing through his propeller hub, and the twin machine guns on his cowl erupted, sending a stream of glowing green tracers toward the bomber. Inside the Chicago typewriter, Hughes saw the sparkling flashes on the wings of the approaching fighter. "Open fire! Give 'em hell!" What happened next defied every tactical doctrine the Luftwaffe had established. Instead of a few defensive tracers, the entire front half of the American bomber seemed to detonate. Marty squeezed his triggers, and the Bendix chin turret came alive with a deafening, mechanical roar. The twin cheek guns opened up. The top turret joined the chorus. Dieter's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. The space between his fighter and the bomber was instantly filled with a solid, blinding wall of red-hot lead. It was not defensive fire. It was a barrage of apocalyptic proportions. "What the?" Dieter shouted, instinctively jerking his control stick violently to the right to evade. He barely escaped the cone of fire. He heard the terrifying thwack, thwack, thwack of armor-piercing rounds tearing through his left wing root, violently rocking his aircraft. Shrapnel slammed into his bulletproof windshield, spiderwebbing the thick glass and showering his lap with fragments. But his wingman, Carl Weber, had no time to react. Following tightly in Dieter's slipstream, Carl flew directly into the concentrated, interlocking fire of the gunship's forward batteries. At a combined speed of 600 miles per hour, the impact was catastrophic. A concentrated burst of 5.0 caliber incendiary rounds walked straight up the nose of Carl's Bf 109, instantly shattering the engine block and penetrating the unarmored lower cockpit. Dieter, fighting his damaged plane out of a spin, looked back over his shoulder, just in time to see Carl's Messerschmitt disintegrate. It didn't catch fire. It simply blew apart under the sheer kinetic force of the heavy American machine guns. The wings sheared off, and the fuselage tumbled into a chaotic, flaming plunge toward the earth. No parachute emerged. "Carl!" Dieter screamed into his radio, his breath catching in his throat. The German radio frequency descended into absolute chaos. "They have heavy cannons in the nose. Pull away! Pull away! My engine is hit. I'm bailing out. It's a trap. The lead bomber is a flak ship." The surviving German fighters scattered like frightened birds, completely abandoning their coordinated attack run. The psychological shock of facing a bomber that fought back with the ferocity of a destroyer had shattered their discipline. Inside the Chicago typewriter, the noise was deafening, a cacophony of roaring engines, hammering guns, and the high-pitched whine of the turret motors. The air was so thick with gun smoke that Hughes could barely see the instrument panel. "Target destroyed!" Marty yelled from the nose, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and elation. The other one broke off. "Waist gunners, talk to me," Hughes demanded over the intercom. "We got 'em, Captain," came the reply from the left waist gunner. "We caught 2 more trying to slash through the middle. They never expected the twin mounts. The sky is full of kraut aluminum." For a fleeting, triumphant moment, the crew of the Chicago typewriter felt invincible. The top brass's crazy experiment had worked. They had taken the Luftwaffe's deadliest tactic and shoved it right back down their throats. 16 guns had created an impenetrable fortress. But the laws of physics, unlike military doctrine, cannot be surprised or outsmarted. The engagement had lasted less than 2 minutes, but the cost was immense. The B-17 shuddered violently. "Captain, check your manifold pressure," Gallagher yelled, pointing frantically at the center console. Hughes looked down. The massive expenditure of ammunition, thousands of heavy rounds fired in seconds, had created a severe center of gravity shift. More critically, the intense, violent recoil of 16 heavy machine guns, firing simultaneously, had wreaked havoc on the heavily stressed airframe. "Number 3, engine is running rough," Hughes noted, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "Oil pressure is dropping. We pushed the engines past the red line just to keep up before the fight," Gallagher said grimly. "That evasive maneuvering during the pass. We over-torqued the props." Ahead of them, the main bomber stream was approaching the initial point, IP, for the bomb run over Kiel. The standard B-17’s, having survived the fighter pass thanks to the gunship's sacrifice, opened their bomb bay doors. "Bombs away," the radio operator relayed, monitoring the lead ship signals. Thousands of tons of high explosives tumbled toward the German docks. And then, the fatal flaw of the YB-40 experiment revealed itself. Freed of their heavy bomb loads, the standard B-17’s instantly surged forward, picking up speed and altitude. They became lighter, faster, and more maneuverable. They began their wide turn back toward the safety of the English Channel. The Chicago typewriter, however, had dropped no bombs. She was still burdened by 4,000 pounds of heavy steel armor plating. She still carried over 7,000 rounds of unfired, heavy, .50 caliber ammunition. "Increase throttle, Artie," Gallagher urged. "They're pulling away from us." "I have them firewalled, Tommy," Hughes shouted back, his voice strained. He fought the yoke, trying to coax more speed out of the groaning engines. The number 3 engine began to trail a thin wisp of gray smoke. "We can't keep up. We're too damn heavy." Miles away, Dieter von Reuter had managed to stabilize his heavily damaged fighter. He sat in his shattered cockpit, shivering violently from the cold air rushing through the broken canopy, his heart mourning the loss of his wingman. The engagement had been a disaster, but as he banked his sputtering fighter back toward the mainland to nurse it home, he glanced down at the retreating American bomber stream. His eyes locked onto a single, olive-drab shape. The heavily armed monster, the flying flak ship that had obliterated Karl, was falling behind. The gap between it and the safety of the main formation was widening by the second. The great beast was bleeding speed, its engines visibly struggling against its own massive weight. Dieter keyed his radio, his voice cold and devoid of its previous panic. "Command, this is Schwarm Leader, the American trap. It is too heavy. It is dropping out of formation. Scramble all available reserves from Sector Nord. It is isolated. We have a straggler." The beast had bared its teeth, but now, stripped of its flock and burdened by its own armor, the Chicago typewriter was alone in the hostile sky. The hunters were regrouping, and the real nightmare was just beginning. The silence inside a bomber after a firefight is never truly silent. It is a hollow, ringing space, filled with the deafening drone of the radial engines, the rush of sub-zero wind through newly punched bullet holes, and the ragged, adrenaline-fueled breathing of 10 terrified men. Aboard the Chicago typewriter, Captain Arthur Hughes wrestled with the flight yoke, his muscles burning with lactic acid. The aircraft, already a beast to handle due to the 4,000 pounds of extra armor, was now flying asymmetrically. "Feather number 3, Hughes barked over the intercom, his voice cutting through the heavy static. First Lieutenant Tommy Gallagher's hands flew across the overhead console. He cut the fuel to the failing right inboard engine and engaged the feathering mechanism, turning the massive propeller blades edge-on to the wind to reduce drag. The windmilling prop shuddered violently for 3 agonizing seconds before locking into place. The immediate loss of power hit the heavily burdened gunship like a physical blow. The nose dropped, and the airspeed indicator, already hovering dangerously near the stall warning, plummeted. "We're losing altitude, Artie," Gallagher said, his eyes darting between the artificial horizon and the altimeter. "Down to 22,000. The formation is pulling away at almost 20 miles an hour faster than us." Hughes looked through the armored glass of the cockpit. Far ahead, the silver specks of the 92nd Bombardment Group were becoming smaller, merging into a unified, retreating swarm. They were heading for the English Channel, leaving the Chicago typewriter completely isolated in the hostile sky over Germany. "Pilot to crew," Hughes transmitted, forcing a calm authority into his tone that he absolutely did not feel. "We are falling out of the combat box. We are officially a straggler. Strip this ship of anything that isn't bolted down or meant to kill Germans. I want weight gone. Now." In the waist of the bomber, the reality of their situation set in. Staff Sergeant James O'Reilly descended from his top turret, grabbing a fire axe from the bulkhead. "You heard the man," O'Reilly shouted over the wind, howling through the open waist gun windows. "Dump it all!" The waist gunners, wrapped in thick shearling and trailing their umbilical oxygen hoses, frantically began tearing at the interior. They hurled empty brass casings out the windows by the handful. They ripped out the heavy, insulated flak blankets that lined the floorboards. O'Reilly even unbolted the chemical toilet and shoved it through the aft hatch. But it was a futile effort. They could toss out 50 pounds of loose gear, but they could not toss out the thousands of pounds of steel armor plating that was permanently welded around their crew stations. Nor could they dump the massive, specialized ammunition feeds that held thousands of heavy .50 caliber shells. Those belts were mechanically integrated into the aircraft's superstructure. The very thing that made them a fortress was now an anchor dragging them down into the abyss. "Bombardier to pilot," Marty Lewis called from the nose compartment. "I can try to manually eject the reserve ammo bins for the chin turret." "Negative, Marty," Hughes replied instantly. "Do not dump the ammunition. If they come back, we're going to need every single round. Keep your eyes peeled." Meanwhile, 3,000 feet below and 5 miles to the rear, Oberleutnant Dieter von Reuter was fighting his own battle. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 was weeping oil, the engine temperature gauge pinned in the red. He had managed to limp his shattered fighter away from the American gunship, but he knew he would never make it back to his base at Jever. Dieter keyed his throat microphone, dialing into the regional Luftwaffe command frequency. "Control, this is Schwarm Leader Dieter. My aircraft is heavily damaged. I am putting her down in a field near Neumünster." "Acknowledged, Schwarm Leader," the sterile voice of the controller replied. "Rescue units will be notified." "Wait, Control," Dieter coughed, smoke beginning to fill his tight cockpit. "The American straggler, the heavy ship that destroyed Feldwebel Weber. It is crippled. Grid reference Anton Caesar, heading 270, altitude dropping through 6,000 meters. It is a heavily up-armored gunship. Frontal assault is suicide. Repeat, do not attack from the front. Understood, Schwarm Leader. We have scrambled elements of Jagdgeschwader 11 from Husum. Focke-Wulfs are airborne and vectoring to intercept. Dieter smiled grimly behind his oxygen mask. JG-11 was commanded by Major Wilhelm Hertz, a ruthless, methodical tactician who flew the heavily armed Focke-Wulf Falv 190 Werger, Butcher Bird. If Dieter's nimble Messerschmitt was a rapier, Hertz's Focke-Wulf was a broadsword, armed with 4 20mm cannons, designed specifically to tear heavy bombers into shreds. "Good hunting, Major," Dieter whispered, before sliding his canopy open and preparing for a violent, gear-up crash landing in a snow-covered German pasture. Aboard the Chicago typewriter, the illusion of safety had completely evaporated. 10 minutes had passed since they lost the formation. The sky around them was deceptively clear, a brilliant, piercing blue. But the crew knew the rules of the high-altitude war. A lone bomber was blood in the water. In the tail gunner's compartment, a cramped, freezing glass blister at the extreme rear of the aircraft, Sergeant Thomas Red Campbell squeezed the twin grips of his heavy machine guns. He had the loneliest job on the plane. He was separated from the rest of the crew by the massive tailwheel structure and the vast, empty cavern of the fuselage. Suddenly, Red's intercom crackled. Tail gunner to pilot. Contrails. 6 o'clock low, climbing fast. Hughes gripped the yoke tighter. How many, Red? I count. 6. No, 8. 8 bogies, Captain. They're spreading out. They look different than the ones that hit us from the front. Wider wings, squarer noses. Focke-Wulfs, Gallagher said quietly, exchanging a dark look with Hughes. All right, boys, Hughes announced, his voice tight. The element of surprise is gone. They know what we are, and they know we're alone. Let's make them pay for every inch of sky. Major Wilhelm Hertz leveled his Focke-Wulf Fio 190 at 21,000 feet. Through the thick, armored glass of his canopy, he studied the isolated American bomber. The straggler was massive, its olive-drab paint standing out starkly against the white clouds far below. One of its right engines was dead, the propeller blades stationary. Hertz had listened to the frantic radio reports from the shattered Messerschmitt squadron. 16 guns. A wall of fire from the nose. A flying flak ship. Schwarm 2. Schwarm 3. Hertz transmitted, his voice cold and analytical. We do not attack from the 12 o'clock. The Americans have concentrated their firepower in the front. We will attack from the rear quarters, low and high. We use our cannon range to outreach their machine guns. Tear the wings off. The Focke-Wulfs possessed a distinct advantage. Their MG 151 20mm cannons could fire high-explosive shells that were devastating upon impact, and their effective range slightly exceeded the accurate range of the American .50 caliber machine guns. Hertz pushed his throttle forward, leading the first element of 4 fighters in a climbing curve, positioning himself directly behind and slightly below the American bomber's tail, the classic 6 o'clock low approach. In the tail of the Chicago typewriter, Red Campbell watched the hunters align themselves. The Focke-Wulfs were painted in mottled gray and green camouflage, their yellow noses aimed directly at him like spears. Here they come! 6 o'clock low, Red screamed into the mic. He didn't wait for them to close to point-blank range. Red opened fire at 800 yards, the twin heavy barrels of his turret bucking wildly. He walked the glowing red tracers down toward the leading fighter. Hertz saw the glowing streams of lead reaching out for him. He expertly kicked his rudder pedals, yawing his Fu 190 out of the line of fire without losing speed. Now, Hertz commanded. 4 Focke-Wulfs opened fire simultaneously. The air around the Chicago typewriter exploded into chaos. The German 20mm cannon shells did not simply punch holes. They detonated upon impact. A cluster of high-explosive rounds slammed into the left horizontal stabilizer of the bomber. The explosion sheared away a massive chunk of the aluminum skin, exposing the ribbing beneath and violently pitching the nose of the aircraft upward. "Hold here, Artie," Gallagher yelled, throwing his entire body weight onto the control yoke to push the nose back down. Another burst of cannon fire raked the fuselage. Inside the unpressurized cabin, the noise was catastrophic, a deafening sequence of metallic thunderclaps. In the waist, O'Reilly and the other gunners were thrown against the bulkheads as the aircraft violently shuddered. Shrapnel from a 20mm shell ripped through the aluminum skin just aft of the radio room, tearing through the complex mechanical tracks that fed ammunition to the waist guns. "Left waist feed is jammed," the gunner screamed, frantically yanking at the tangled belt of .50 caliber shells. "The track is completely shredded." Hertz pulled up and away, banking sharply to let the next element of fighters take their turn. He was deeply impressed by the bomber's resilience. The extra armor plating was doing its job, standard B-17’s would have crumpled under that initial cannon barrage, their control cables severed and their crews decimated. This beast, however, absorbed the punishment and kept flying, its remaining 3 engines howling in defiance. But Hertz was a patient predator. "They are tough," he radioed his men. "Target the inboard engines. Burn them out." The next wave of fighters attacked from the sides, exploiting the temporary jam in the left waist gun. They swooped in at oblique angles, aiming their cannons at the vulnerable wing roots where the massive fuel tanks were located. Marty Lewis, trapped in the nose compartment, was furious and helpless. His newly installed Bendix chin turret, the very weapon that had slaughtered the first wave of attackers, was completely useless. The German pilots were strictly avoiding the front of the aircraft. "They're staying out of my arc," Marty yelled, pounding his fist against the ammunition box. "I can't get a bead on them." "Conserve your ammo, Marty," Hughes replied over the intercom, his voice strained from the physical effort of fighting the dying aircraft. "They're trying to pick us apart." Suddenly, a terrifying scream echoed over the radio. It was Red Campbell, in the tail. "Tail's hit. I'm hit. The whole back end is gone." The transmission cut out in a roar of static. A Focke-Wulf had scored a direct hit on the tail gunner's blister. A 20mm high-explosive shell had penetrated the armored glass, detonating inside the cramped compartment. The explosion shattered the twin guns, obliterated the mounting brackets, and blew the emergency escape hatch clean off its hinges. "Red! Report! Red!" Hughes yelled. Nothing but static answered him. "I'll go check on him," O'Reilly shouted from the waist, abandoning his jammed gun station. He grabbed a portable oxygen bottle, unhooked his headset, and began the treacherous, terrifying crawl through the narrow, freezing tail section. The wind, howling through the shattered aft fuselage, was like a physical wall, threatening to suck him out into the void. Outside, Hertz saw the American tail guns fall silent. The blind spot had been created. "The tail is dead," Hertz announced. "Move in for the kill. Swarm 2. Take the left wing. Swarm 3. The right. Finish it." 6 Focke-Wulfs fell into a line astern formation, directly behind the Chicago typewriter, casually lining up their shots in the newly created safe zone. They were no longer fighting a dreadnought. They were executing a firing squad. "They're lining up on our 6, Captain," the radio operator screamed, peering through the Astrodome. "We have no rear coverage." Hughes realized they were out of options. The immense armor that had saved them from the head-on pass was now a metal coffin, trapping them in the sky while they were systematically dismantled from behind. The heavy guns in the nose were useless. But Hughes was not a man to die passively. If the aircraft was going to go down, he was going to make the Luftwaffe bleed for it. "Tommy," Hughes said, his voice dropping an octave, devoid of panic. "They're sitting right behind us, right in the blind spot." "Yeah, Artie, I know," Gallagher replied, wiping blood from a superficial shrapnel cut on his forehead. "Remember when we said, 'This thing handles like a pregnant whale'?" Gallagher looked at his captain, a sudden, desperate realization dawning in his eyes. "Artie, you can't. The airframe won't take it. The wing spars are already compromised. If we fly straight, we die in 30 seconds. Hughes growled, his hands gripping the yoke so tightly, his knuckles were stark white against his leather gloves. "Hold on to something." Without warning, Hughes slammed his right foot down hard on the rudder pedal and violently wrenched the control yoke to the right and back. It was a maneuver that a heavy bomber was never designed to perform. The Chicago typewriter, weighing over 60,000 pounds and severely unbalanced by damage and dead engines, shrieked in protest. The rivets along the fuselage popped like gunshots. The massive wings flexed upward to a terrifying, impossible degree. But the violent, uncoordinated skid threw the massive aircraft into a sudden, flat, horizontal slide. Behind them, Major Hertz and his firing squad were perfectly lined up, expecting the bomber to lumber straight ahead. Suddenly, The entire broadside of the massive B-17 swung violently into their path, completely exposing the right flank of the aircraft to the German fighters. "Fire! Every gun on the right side! Fire!" Hughes roared. The abrupt, violent skid brought the right waist guns, the top turret, and the right cheek gun completely into bear on the tightly packed formation of Focke-Wulfs. O'Reilly, who had just dragged a severely wounded Red Campbell back into the radio room, threw himself into the top turret and slammed his thumbs down on the firing triggers. The right waist gunner, previously with no targets, opened up with his twin mount, a devastating, concentrated broadside of heavy 5.0 caliber fire tore through the sky, ripping directly into the path of the stunned German fighters. The hunter had suddenly, violently, become the hunted again. The sheer, desperate audacity of Captain Arthur Hughes' maneuver defied every established principle of heavy bomber aerodynamics, violating the very laws of physics the Boeing engineers had relied upon. By violently stamping his right boot down on the rudder pedal, while simultaneously hauling the control yoke back and to the right with bone-jarring force, he initiated an act of aeronautical heresy. He was throwing a 60,000-pound, heavily modified aircraft into a flat, uncoordinated skid at 200 miles an hour. He turned a fleeing, vulnerable target into a stationary, mid-air broadside battery. It was an archaic naval tactic crossing the T, executed in the freezing stratosphere, and it caught the elite, highly disciplined German pilots completely off guard. Inside the cockpit of the Chicago typewriter, the physical toll of the maneuver was immense. The control columns fought back with the strength of a bucking concrete pillar. Hughes and his co-pilot, First Lieutenant Tommy Gallagher, strained against the yokes, their boots planted firmly against the base of the instrument panels, just to gain leverage. Their arm muscles burned as the heavy gunship shrieked in mechanical agony. The immense aerodynamic pressure of the slipstream slammed violently against the broad, flat side of the olive-drab fuselage, protesting the unnatural orientation. Major Wilhelm Hertz, flying point for the trailing element of Focke-Wulfs, had anticipated a straight, panicked dive from the crippled American bomber. His thumb had been resting lightly on his cannon triggers, waiting for the B-17's wings to level out in the crosshairs of his Revi sight. Instead, the massive silhouette abruptly swung sideways, filling his windshield not with the vulnerable tail section, but with the terrifying, heavily armored right flank of the gunship. "Break! Break away!" Hertz screamed into his throat microphone, his voice cracking, frantically trying to yank his nimble W-190 up and over the massive aluminum cliff that had just materialized directly in his flight path. But at closing speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, human reflexes and mechanical linkages were woefully insufficient. The entire right side of the YB-40 erupted in a blinding, synchronized sheet of muzzle flashes. Staff Sergeant James O'Reilly, tracking his top turret blindly through the violent, lateral G-forces of the skid, clamped his hands down on the firing triggers and screamed a wordless battle cry. At the exact same moment, the right waist gunner, who had been completely starved of targets for the entire engagement, poured a massive, unbroken stream of 5.0 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the tightly packed, stunned German formation. Even the right cheek gunner in the nose compartment joined the fray, adding his twin streams of lead to the onslaught. The freezing sky instantly transformed into a chaotic blender of crossing tracers, dense black gun smoke, and red-hot metal. A Focke-Wulf, flying slightly below and to the right of Hertz's lead aircraft, caught the absolute devastating brunt of the waist gunner's twin-mount barrage. Dozens of heavy, incendiary machine gun rounds tore effortlessly through the fighter's spinning BMW radial engine, immediately severing the highly volatile aviation fuel lines and shattering the cylinders. The German fighter did not simply catch fire. It detonated into a brilliant, terrifyingly brief fireball. The explosion was so violently concussive that it shattered the canopy of the neighboring FW-190, showering that pilot in burning debris and immediately shearing off his left wing. Two elite hunters of the Luftwaffe, veterans of a dozen air battles, were completely obliterated in a fraction of a second, leaving nothing behind but falling wreckage and thick, oily smoke. Hertz felt the terrifying, heavy thud of .50 caliber rounds slamming mercilessly into his own aircraft. The rhythmic, hammering impacts shook him to his core. His instrument panel shattered in a spray of sparks, showering him with jagged glass and searing hot engine oil. The control stick violently kicked out of his hand, nearly breaking his wrist, as an armor-piercing round cleanly severed his main aileron control cable. "My controls are dead!" Engine hit. Hertz transmitted, his famously cold, analytical demeanor finally cracking under the sheer, unexpected terror of the American broadside. He threw open his shattered canopy, the sub-zero wind violently tearing at his leather jacket, and prepared to throw himself into the void. The apex predator had been thoroughly broken by the prey. Inside the bomber, the frantic cheers of the surviving crewmen were instantly swallowed by a sound far more terrifying than any enemy cannon fire. It was a deep, resonating, metallic groan that vibrated through the very skeleton of the aircraft, traveling up through the floorboards and into the boots of every man aboard. The violent skid, while brilliantly saving them from the German firing squad, had doomed the ship. The Chicago typewriter was carrying 4,000 pounds of steel armor plating, drastically shifting its center of gravity and adding unbearable weight to its frame. When Hughes forced the aircraft sideways through the air, the immense aerodynamic pressure slammed against the massive 100-foot wingspan. The structural limits of the Boeing airframe, already critically weakened by Hertz's earlier 20mm cannon strikes, were catastrophically exceeded. "Artie, the wing! Look at the wing!" Gallagher screamed, pointing a trembling, blood-stained finger out the right-hand window. Hughes snapped his head over, and his blood ran cold. The massive right wing, bearing the tremendous weight of 2 radial engines and thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel, was visibly buckling. The main spar, the primary, heavy structural beam that anchored the wing to the fuselage, was snapping under the immense, twisting torque of the skid. The thick aluminum skin on the top surface of the wing was wrinkling like cheap tinfoil, popping rivets into the freezing air with the sharp, rapid-fire staccato of a machine gun. "Level her out! Help me pull!" Hughes roared, throwing his entire body weight against the yoke in a desperate, final attempt to correct the skid and relieve the agonizing pressure on the dying airframe. Gallagher joined him without hesitation, both men straining until the blood vessels in their necks bulged. The aircraft viciously fought them, bucking and screaming as the aerodynamic forces tore at its mortal wounds. Then, the death blow landed. The No. 4 engine, mounted on the extreme far end of the failing right wing, violently tore loose from its shattered engine mounts. The heavy radial engine tumbled away into the sky, wildly severing fuel lines and instantly igniting a massive, roaring river of white-hot fire that trailed behind the bomber like a comet's tail. "We've lost No. 4. Massive fire on the right wing," Gallagher shouted, frantically hammering the engine fire extinguisher toggles. But the chemical foam was utterly useless against the uncontained torrent of burning aviation fuel. The Chicago typewriter, the invincible flying tank, had finally collapsed. The extra armor that had made it a fortress had become a fatal anchor, dragging it down, and the sheer weight of its own unparalleled defenses was literally tearing it apart from the inside out. The heat radiating from the wing was already beginning to blister the paint on the fuselage. "Pilot to crew!" Hughes' voice cracked over the intercom, stripped of its usual steady command, and replaced with the raw urgency of a man out of time. "Bail out! Bail out! We are going down! Abandon ship!" Hughes reached up and smashed the button for the bailout alarm. The bell began to ring a shrill, piercing, mechanical shriek that cut through the roar of the massive electrical fire and the howling, freezing wind. It was the sound of the absolute end. The interior of the YB-40 was a tilted, burning nightmare. As the right wing continued to fold upward, the aircraft went into a violent, irrecoverable death spiral. Centrifugal force pinned the crewmen against the bulkheads, making every movement a Herculean effort. In the radio room, O'Reilly was struggling to drag the bleeding Red Campbell toward the main escape hatch. The floorboards were slick with hydraulic fluid and blood. "Leave me, Jimmy," Red choked out, clutching his shrapnel-torn shoulder. "The ship is spinning too fast. You can't carry me." "Shut up, Red. We're both going home," O'Reilly screamed back, his muscles burning as he fought against the G-forces. He kicked the emergency release for the main hatch. The heavy door ripped away into the slipstream. The roar of the rushing air was deafening. O'Reilly grabbed Red by the harness, physically hauling him to the edge of the void, and shoved him out into the freezing sky before diving out right behind him. In the nose compartment, Marty Lewis was facing a uniquely horrifying problem. The installation of the massive Bendix chin turret and its extensive mechanical linkages had completely obstructed the standard bombardier's escape hatch. He was trapped in a glass cage that was rapidly plummeting toward the earth. "Captain, the nose hatch is jammed by the turret feed," Marty screamed into his microphone, frantically kicking at the thick plexiglass. It wouldn't yield. The armor that was supposed to protect him was now a coffin. Up in the cockpit, Hughes and Gallagher were fighting a losing battle to keep the plane level enough for the crew to escape. The control yoke was practically useless, the cables slack or severed. "Artie, we have to go," Gallagher yelled, unbuckling his harness. The heat from the burning right wing was blistering the paint on the outside of the cockpit glass. "Marty is trapped in the nose," Hughes shouted back. "Go, Tommy. Get out. I'm not leaving you." "That's an order, Lieutenant. Bail out." Hughes shoved Gallagher toward the top hatch. Reluctantly, Gallagher scrambled up, fighting the intense spin of the aircraft, and threw himself out into the slipstream, his parachute instantly ripping open in the violent air. Hughes was alone. The sky outside the windows was a dizzying blur of blue and white as the bomber spiraled downward. He unclipped his harness and grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the bulkhead. Fighting the crushing centrifugal force, he dragged himself down the narrow crawlway that led beneath the cockpit floor to the nose compartment. He found Marty backed against the reinforced bulkhead, staring in horror at the approaching ground. "Get back!" Hughes roared over the din. He swung the heavy steel cylinder of the fire extinguisher with all his remaining strength, smashing it into the reinforced cheek gun window. The first blow merely spider-webbed the glass. The second blow, fueled by absolute desperation, shattered the pane. "Go! Squeeze through," Hughes ordered, shoving the bombardier toward the jagged opening. Marty didn't hesitate. He scrambled through the shattered window, his flight suit tearing on the glass, and tumbled out into the sky. Hughes turned to follow, but the aircraft gave a final, catastrophic shudder. With a sound like a thunderclap, the weakened right wing finally sheared off completely. The Chicago typewriter instantly snapped into a violent, uncontrolled tumble. Hughes was thrown violently against the roof of the nose compartment, the wind knocked out of his lungs. The world became a chaotic blender of noise, smoke, and terrifying velocity. He scrambled blindly, his hands cut and bleeding, reaching for the shattered window. The ground was rushing up with terrifying speed, green fields and dark forests expanding to fill his entire vision. With one last desperate push, Arthur Hughes threw himself headfirst through the jagged hole. The wind hit him like a concrete wall, instantly ripping him away from the dying metal beast. He tumbled wildly through the freezing air, his hands frantically searching for his parachute ripcord. He found the metal D-ring and yanked it hard. A second later, the canopy blossomed above him with a bone-jarring crack. He swung wildly in his harness, gasping for air. Less than 1,000 feet below him, the Chicago typewriter, the heavily armored dreadnought that was supposed to change the tide of the air war, slammed into a German forest. The impact triggered the thousands of gallons of remaining fuel and the thousands of rounds of heavy ammunition. A massive, rolling fireball erupted into the sky, followed by the staccato popping of cooking off machine gun rounds. Hughes hung in the absolute silence of his parachute, watching the black smoke rise from the pyre of his ship. They had survived the deadliest fighters the Luftwaffe had to offer, only to be destroyed by the very armor meant to protect them. The beast had been too heavy for the sky. The YB-40 flying cruiser experiment was officially deemed a failure by the United States Army Air Forces in the fall of 1943. While the gunships successfully demonstrated an overwhelming capacity for defensive firepower, the fatal flaw of their design could not be overcome. Burdened by massive armor plating and extreme ammunition loads, they were entirely unable to keep pace with standard bomber formations once the regular B-17’s dropped their payloads. This relegated the expensive, heavily armed dreadnoughts to the deadly role of isolated stragglers. However, the blood and sacrifice of crews like those aboard the Chicago typewriter were not entirely in vain. The tactical data gathered from the YB-40's engagements proved that devastating forward firepower could effectively neutralize the Luftwaffe's dreaded head-on attacks. This critical revelation directly led to the permanent implementation of the Bendix chin turret on the legendary B-17G, saving countless American lives in the skies over Europe.